Welcome, I'm Darren, and I'll be your guide today as I talk about the early years of Pacific football cards. And the reason I say the early years is because when you talk about 1991 and 1992 Pacific, you got to talk about the lead-in. Pacific is one of the two main card brands that started out with a pretty long history of making sports cards before they launched into making full-blown card sets as we were the main base brands that we were chasing throughout the hobby. Score is the more famous of the two because they had a more interesting history. They did a number of things that were a lot flashier, and they were also a national brand. We got to see them across the entire country. Pacific, that just wasn't the case. And so when you look at the early cards, you basically get to see where they came up with the ideas that they would ultimately create in their card set. And it starts off with early to mid 1980s. They did a couple of card sets that were based on legends. And these legends sets there was a baseball set and there was a football set. The baseball set is a bunch of old baseball legends, very similar to the football cards, but the football set is the one that really is interesting. And it also happens to pertain to this topic, so that's where I'm going to focus. And the legends cards these are interesting. So they have a very ye old-timey look to them. There's a sepia tone to the whole card design. They have a ye old-timey wanted poster-esque kind of design component to the card front, and black and white shot of the famous player. And then the card back is, it really does look like a novelty card. But what's interesting about this card set is twofold. It is a college set. It's not pro players. Specifically, it's the Pac-10. So we're talking about USC, UCLA, Stanford, Cal, Arizona, Arizona State, Oregon, Oregon State, Washington, and shockingly, Washington State. Those are the 10 colleges that were a part of this. And it's a much older program, or it's a much older conference than people tend to think about. So the conference itself, these cards were looking at legends from these teams over the entire course of the conference. And when I say legends, I mean we're not talking about John Elway and Marcus Allen and Ronnie Lott. Those guys don't appear in this card set. Basically, it's everybody whose professional career had basically come to a close. These were the college cards. Not a huge set, but still. These were impressive players. So you had O.J. Simpson, you had Lynn Swann, you had Frank Gifford. You really did have some top-end talent of players who were legends from the Pac-10. But the big thing in this set is they're not all pro players, because you've also got John Wayne. Yes, John Wayne the actor. You also have Jackie Robinson, as in Jackie Robinson the baseball player. And you have Pop Warner, who we're probably most familiar with being associated with little kids with big helmets, but he was a legendary coach early in the 20th century. And so you have those three individuals who pop up in the set, which really does make it a very interesting card set. But it's not the kind of card set you're going to see all the time. It's kind of tucked over into the corner, and it's, it is really interesting place where the cards started. But the card stock is another story all unto itself. It's a very thick, very firm card stock. It feels more like it was cut off of a cereal box or something, and yet it's stronger than that. So they weren't just making some real cheap thing they were churning out. They were trying to make something that was sturdy and would hold up. It was probably the best made card at that time. But it was still an interesting little affair that they did early on. But the name Pacific specifically refers to the Pacific Northwest. This is a company that was based in the Seattle area. So obviously that's why they were interested in the Pac-10, and obviously Pacific, that makes perfect sense. But because they were in the Seattle area, that means that the Seahawks were their natural opportunity for making cards. And starting in 1987, they would make cards for Franz Bread and for Snyder Stores. So in 1987, they made a very small card set of Seattle Seahawks cards. And these cards are, how do I put this? Let's just say they are bathed in the Seattle Seahawks team colors. The card is a simple portrait shot with some basic accoutrements, primarily a grid down either side, which almost has a hint of what was going to come in Pro Set in a few years. The card is pretty well designed overall, and on the card back, it looks like it came with a loaf of bread. But they did start off with this, or I shouldn't say they started off with this card set, but this was the beginning of their making annual cards. And this card set, the Seahawks card set, this was released for Franz Bread, and in the very next year, in 1988, they made what's almost the exact same set. They made the updated set, which is, it says 1988 at the top. It's missing the grid on the sides, but it also says Snyder instead of Franz. Now, it was still with Franz Bread, it's just that Snyder was the association they made. So these were the first two sets that we saw where they were actually starting to get into making professional cards. And in 1989, they would make a big step forward as they also transitioned from Franz Bread to Oro-Wheat bread. And when they shifted over to Oro-Wheat, this was a much bigger company, and the card set got a lot bigger, but the card set got really professional. Now the cards were made with a cardstock very similar to what we saw with Score and Pro Set. They also had a speckly silver band around the outside, which was, we would see that with NBA Hoops in 1990. So they were really making some high-end cards here. They also got really into a good card design where they have a partial inner border. They're working in the team colors into all this, the band down at the bottom. The way the whole card was designed, it looks like they were actually taking this serious and getting into some really, really good card design. So the way this was coming together, it looked like it was ready for us to see some more packs of cards. And what a great opportunity for that, because in 1989 they made a card set of Steve Largent. Now, Steve Largent does appear in the Oro-Wheat cards, obviously has the Oro-Wheat symbol on it, and it's card number 15. That is a standalone, or that is an individual card in the Oro-Wheat cards, but they have, in packs, they sold Steve Largent cards celebrating his career. So his career was coming to a close, and Pacific made what was very similar to the 1959 Fleer Ted Williams set. This one for Largent, where the whole card set is looking at his entire career. All the cards are designed basically the same way as the Oro-Wheat cards, which is a trend that would pick up in just a couple of years. So there's one Steve Largent card that's not a part of the set that has an Oro-Wheat logo on it, etc., etc. And like with the Ted Williams set, this set does include his career, obviously, different moments from his career. It also looks at different parts of his life, from when he was really young all the way to what was basically the present day. But this card set also features many players from throughout the league. John Elway, Jim Zorn. So you do have a couple of extra players that show up in this card set if you happen to be a collector of those players of those teams. But the card set also has some very interesting cards where it looks like pieces of a card, because that's what it is. The card set has a whole series of puzzle pieces for a big oversized card. And this was very similar to what we had seen in the Topps UK set, where they had miniature pieces of a big oversized William Perry card. In this case, it's the exact same thing, except all of the pieces are full card size. They have the front and the back, which are oriented differently because that's the way all the cards are designed. And the oversized card is very big. It is roughly this big. And the card, I don't know exactly, because it's front and back, I don't know exactly how you expect for kids to, what you expect kids to do with it. But these are actually cards in the set where the numbers, none of these cards are numbered, but as you can tell, they did make one full size, or I shouldn't say one, but they did make a full size version of this oversized card. And I don't know exactly how this related to it all. I haven't gotten into it to that extent, but they do have that as kind of a standalone for this card set. But the Steve Largent card set is it's not their first foray into packs of cards. I mean, they did that with the Legends. But we're now starting to see them getting very professional, and while they were making some baseball sets at the same time, it was like ramping up to when they were going to go full-blown into the NFL. But before they got to that, they did have another 1990 Oro-Wheat card set, and now you're starting to see a card that's more familiar to what you're used to. This was kind of a hybrid of the next two sets. Pretty cool cards. The set was a lot bigger. And then in 1991 with their Oro-Wheat cards, okay, now we're looking at a card that we're familiar with. The Oroweek cards were almost done like promo cards for their main releases for the national set. And 1991, 1992, and 1993, all three of those do follow the exact same model as what we would see for the equivalent releases at the national level. 1994 is different, and it's kind of like a proto card for a release that would be done a few years later. And then the last set they did, they got back to Franz for a 1997 set, which was designed more like the Pacific Philadelphia cards. But I'm not going to get too far into that because we want to talk about the NFL cards. But that was happening at the same time. These Oroweek cards were happening at the same time. So you can see that the Oroweek cards led the company straight up to when they got to 1991 for their main release. They were ready to go. They'd figured this all out and they'd made it work. So the 1991 card design is an outer border with white and then a team colored slash at either end. And then they have an inner box with a border down the side with the other team color with a color fade, and a big picture in the middle. And the team colors are all unique to every single team. The Raiders kind of interesting because they have pink on it, but you got to understand they were in LA at the time. Pink would not apply to the Oakland Raiders, but for the LA Raiders, it makes perfect sense. So the set did have the color coding of all of the teams, which made the cards look really good. And then on the card back, they had a really interesting diagonal pattern, which made the cards very distinct and very avant-garde. Unfortunately, it's a little bit too much, and it's not something they could sustain. But it made the cards absolutely stand out if you happen to come across them, which Pacific had a difficult time making their national presence. So there are a lot of cards that are remaining because very many people collected them. The card does have an interesting quality to the card stock. This was a card stock that wasn't quite like Fleer and Donruss. It was similar. It had almost a papery card back, but it was a firmer card stock than that. So the front was a semi-gloss. The back was not a glossy card, except the ink had kind of a glossy effect on it, making a very intricate kind of appearance on the card back. But because the back was more papery, these cards really don't tend to stick together, which works really well for the insert, which I'll get to in a minute. But before I get to that, so they had a Series 1, and it was from Atlanta through Washington, and then they had a bunch of rookies at the back of the set. These rookies are all in their college uniforms, and the color alignment does not match up with the actual team that they would be drafted with, because I don't think they knew at that time. But not all of the rookies were stuffed at the back. There are a couple that are intermixed within the card set, so they do show up in various places. Probably not with the team that would actually draft them, which does get kind of confusing, but that's the way that they built the Series 1 set. Series 2 is a much smaller set, and this is basically just a bunch of rookies in their pro uniform with a card design that is designed for the pro team, Atlanta through Washington. And the rookies from Series 1 reappear in Series 2 in their new uniforms, but it's mostly a bunch of players who had not been featured in Series 1. And if you're opening packs and boxes, the Series 2 set does not have any Series 1 cards in it, so it's a very small set packed into these packs. One box is going to get you multiple sets. It's a very different rate that these cards appeared in. But I did mention that they had inserts, and the inserts are a set called Picks the Pros, and this is very similar to the main card design, except it has so much gold foil around the outside of the card. On the inside, where the player name had been and the color of the team color fade, it's replaced by a blue and red intermixing of color fading with gold foil that says Picks the Pros, so the player's name is dumped down to the bottom, and a big picture in the middle. The card back is blue and red, which is significant. We'll get to that. The card set, though, also does have a parallel to it, which was in silver. So every one of the 25 cards also has a silver parallel as well. One of the very first sets to have parallels. So gold and silver, 50 total cards. And that was Series 1. And thankfully, those cards did have that papery card back, so these cards don't tend to get damaged in these packs. But good luck finding one, because they are very rare to get in boxes. And that was 1991. And then along with 1991, before we move on to 1992, they also did a small card set called Pacific Flashcards. This was an educational set, not done in exactly the same way as what had been done with Pro Set and Fact. But for these, they are literally flashcards. It's a 110 card set, and all of the cards are on the true front. It's a mathematical equation. On the other side is a picture of the player, and his jersey number is the answer to the question. They also have a little write-up about the player, and they're all numbered. So that is another set that they did, and technically the picture of the player is the card back, not the card front. But at any rate, it's a fun little set and a very common set to run into. So for 1992, they were starting to get their feet on the ground, but they were still having a tough time introducing themselves to the American public. It was going to take a while for the hobby to pick up on them. The card design for 1992 was a simplified version where they got rid of the big border around the outside and just did a thin white band around the outside. They still have the team color fade on the side and more room for a picture. And the pictures are the big thing about Pacific. Michael Kramer, the CEO of the company, was a sports photographer. He was on the sidelines taking pictures of players, which gave the company an unusual opportunity. Because the photographer is basically part of the design process. He's out trying to get pictures for these players, which gave him the ability to better customize the shots he would get and get pictures of some unusual players. So there are a couple of cards in this card set that you don't see elsewhere, like Ben Coates' only rookie card was in 1992. And he wouldn't even have one in 1993. It would take a while until he would get discovered. Well, he showed up in this card set. And part of the reason for these unusual players who would show up in this card set was because it is an incredibly unencumbered card set when it comes to stars. There are very few stars in this card set, Series 1 and Series 2. Kind of depleted, which allows more room for players you just wouldn't otherwise see, which is actually kind of cool. And it does play into the whole Ben Coates thing because this was the only place he was at, and that would help to introduce Pacific to the public. But the card back was now starting to look professional. They were getting really good at that design approach. The cards were not as inspiring. They weren't as distinct as 1991. They also were glossy on both sides, which meant that these cards do have a tendency to not survive decades down the road. The card set was designed in the same way as the previous year, where you had a whole bunch of veterans, no subsets, and then some rookies. But the card set did have more of a 1990 kind of vibe to it because it was 330 cards with rookies stuffed at the back, and then 330 cards with rookies stuffed at the back. The rookies are all in their college uniforms in both series, interestingly, and all of the rookies have a cranberry color theme on the band as opposed to the team color, which was on all the other cards. So all the rookies have that really pretty impressive cranberry card design look. And that was the card set. That was all there was to it. They did do some checklist cards. Interestingly, the checklist cards, though, were done as inserts. And they had checklists for Series 1 and Series 2, and they were numbered across both, basically 1 through 4 and 5 through 8 was the way that they numbered all the checklists. But they did do some more inserts, starting with, unfortunately, Picks the Pros. And the Picks the Pros cards are 25 cards. They're a lot of different players. They have the exact same design. It's just that on the card back, now they have red and yellow as opposed to red and blue. That's the big difference. Again, they do have the gold and they have the silver. These cards do have a tendency to not survive long term because the fact that the packs themselves have a tendency for the cards to stick together. These are the cards that take the biggest brunt of that abuse. But there is a third version of these Picks the Pros, which is a gold foil, which has a different card back, because while all of the cards in the main set are glossy front and back, most of the Picks the Pros cards actually still have a papery card back. But there is another run of the gold cards where they have a glossy card back. And Pacific did say that there was a very fixed number of cards that they printed for each for the gold and for the silver. I don't know if that includes the glossy cards or if they did another run of those later on. I don't know the story between them, and I do not believe that the silver cards came with a glossy card back. I believe those are only the paper card back. And the glossy cards do have a slightly different hue to the tint of gold on the card front, but it's the card back that's the most obvious. So, and I really don't know the way that those extra cards were released. But I will say that when they did their Pacific triple folders, they had the same inserts as the main release of Pacific in those, and I checked with those and they don't seem to be different. So it doesn't look like the triple folders was a new release of cards. So I really am baffled as to where the glossy backed Pacific Picks the Pros cards come from, but every card does have 3 versions of the card. And I do want to take a moment to note that these card sets are not called Pacific. They're actually called Pacific Plus. That's the name for the first couple of years of Pacific's main release. They would then shift over to Crown Collection. They'd come up with different names, but they never, I don't think that they ever had a Pacific card set until I think it was the late 90s. I think that's when that actually happened. At any rate, they did have a couple of other insert sets. The first one to look at is their team leaders. And this is a 30 card set, so it's not exactly one for every single team, but all the teams are represented. And this is a much better card than the cards in the set, simply because it has more going on. And yet at the same time, it doesn't have the same polish, because the cards in the main set really do have a great look to them. But this one looks very much like an insert, and it actually does look really cool. But these cards are very common, so they're not as valuable as I'd like for them to be. They also did a prism card, and this was the first time that Pacific had done prisms. And for this one, they have kind of a cartoon strip down at the bottom for the player name. It's a bunch of running backs and not a big card set. And these cards really do have a pasted on kind of effect to them, which is kind of cool. I do like the way these cards came across. But it's a small card set, and it was a separate one, and then the next year they would start doing a full-blown release of Pacific Prism. This is kind of like a dry run. They also had a card set of Steve Largent, 9 cards, and it looks very basically at his career. These cards are all numbered 1 through 9, and then in Series 2 they did a release of Bob Greasy cards, which were numbered 10 through 18. So it works out to be basically both, it basically works into an 18 card set. I don't know if they intended to continue this in 1993, which would have made a lot of sense, but at any rate, here they did these, and they did release autographed versions of one of each of the cards. So 1 Greasy card and 1 Steve Largent card, and these were all hand numbered on the back out of 1,000. But one of the ways you're likely to find these is there were a lot of replacement cards that were created that just kind of hit the market later on. So you're going to see a lot of them that don't have the number on them, which is actually a more rare way for them to come, but they're not as valuable because they're not the main release cards. Either way you want to do it, that was what they did for 1992 in Pacific for Pacific Plus. So that is the first 2 years of Pacific. And it's also the prehistory, so you can see where they got to and how they got started. Pacific would have a tough time really finding their footing because they weren't driven by design. In fact, 1991, 92, and 93 are among the best, or they're probably the best card designs, although I do have an appreciation for 99. That's another good card design, but otherwise there wasn't a lot of time when Pacific had an identity. Here in the beginning they did, so these cards really do feel a lot better. But Pacific was a company that was desperately in search of a problem to solve, and they were solving so many problems that they were inventing, and it was just a magnificent company. Very humble beginnings, but man, they really did work extremely hard to make interesting cards, and for the most part, they absolutely succeeded. So I'm going to be looking at 93, 94. I'm going to be looking at those in separate videos. This is what I wanted to look at here. So thank you for following along. I hope that you've enjoyed seeing the roots of Pacific trading cards. If you have any questions or any stories about it, or if there's any information you have that I don't have covered in here, please let me know in the comments below. I'm always trying to learn more about this. And subscribe if you haven't done so already. And thank you very much for watching.